In the United States, terms like the Third World and the Global South are meant to indicate other countries and regions, places that are way over there somewhere, across the ocean. But one author, Paul Theroux, in his new book, Deep South, is trying to turn that stereotype on its head. As a result of his travels in the Deep South, Mr. Theroux was left wondering if the Third World hasn't come home to roost on U.S. soil. And the reason for such extreme poverty? Globalization and the outsourcing of factories and jobs. RT correspondent Alexei Yurashevsky recently discussed the book Deep South and the harsh reality for people in poverty in southern states with Mr. Theroux.
Mr. Theroux, thank you so much for joining us. Now, your book, Deep South, is a recollection of your experiences when you traveled in the southern states of America and saw some extreme examples of poverty. Can you enlighten us? What exactly did you see in those states?
My first experience of deep American poverty was driving in the Mississippi Delta from the town of Vicksburg in Mississippi up to Clarksdale. It might be 70 or 80 miles, but it's 70 or 80 miles of the most depressing housing, the saddest people, and the most beleaguered landscape. I didn't realize that such a landscape was possible, that such towns existed in the United States. I should say that I traveled in the rural South. If you go to the cities of the South, Atlanta, Nashville, Tuscaloosa, Birmingham, you get a fairly jolly picture that everything's okay. Travel an hour from any of these places, sometimes travel half an hour out to the hinterland, and you see a completely different America. You see an America that's been, where education has been defunded. You see people out of work. You see, in many cases, very substandard housing. And you see a place that's been outsourced and pretty much destroyed. The people there have deep roots, but it's a part of America that no one realizes still exists. And in many places looks like a third world country.
Now, you mentioned the third world comparison there. And you travel to countries in Africa, in Asia. You know how poverty looks like. Why the comparison of third world and the southern states of the United States? Why does it look like third world countries to you?
There are parts of South Carolina that reminded me forcibly of towns in Zimbabwe. The resemblances are unemployment, kind of hopelessness, the notion, the fact that work has been taken away from people, that farming is highly mechanized in the South, so there's no employment. But even the factories are closed, factories that made carpets, furniture, bicycles. It's American poverty at its worst, and is very surprising, very shocking when you consider that we're so obsessed with helping the world, and we're trying to spread the democratic message and the message of development. We have made China wealthy. We've lifted 600 million people in China out of poverty, and by doing that, we've plunged millions of Americans into poverty.
But is it only because the businesses were moved to different countries? Is it only because of the outsourcing?
It's partly outsourcing, but a lot of it is due to states' governments to defunding education in Alabama, in South Carolina, in Mississippi. The education budgets are very, very low. People trying to save money that way. Healthcare is very poor. You really can't have much happening in any state where education is poorly funded. So it's the will to do something. I would blame, first of all, I would blame the states' governments, the legislatures of these states. South Carolina, for example, leads it. And you take a state like Arkansas, was Bill Clinton's state. Bill Clinton runs the Clinton Global Initiative. He spends most of his time in Africa, in India, AIDS, malaria prevention, and so forth. His state is a disgrace. It's a disgrace in terms of poverty, in terms of child hunger, in terms of education. I'm not Clinton bashing, but there's a man who wants to save the world.
But you were criticized, though, and some were saying that you were economically illiterate, and they were countering your experiences with GDP data. What would you tell to those critics right now?
I'm probably economically illiterate, but I'm a practical person. I've spent the past 50 years traveling in poor countries, and I know how people become poor. When people have work, they don't need welfare. They don't need this sort of nickel and dime. So I know that, that my article caused a fuss. It's not economical literacy, I don't think. I think it's just looking at the world a different way. And I think that I would put my experience of it, 50 years of looking at this, against any economist.
Mr. Theroux, what is the way out of this situation? Do you see any way that this whole poverty can be rectified in the southern states?
Sure, it's easily rectified, I think. If people have to care. For some reason, helping Africa is sexier than helping Mississippi. That has to change. Also, I believe that we need to not only care more, we have to see more. We know all about Syria. We know all about Turkey. We know all about India. We don't know all about Alabama and Mississippi and Arkansas, and it's a shame that we don't.
Very, very powerful. Joining us now to discuss the interview with Paul Theroux further is RT correspondent Alexei Yaroshevsky. Welcome very much back to the Hawk's Nest, Alexei.
Thanks for joining us. So
you brought up, criticisms of Mr. Theroux and the book and his kind of message about the Deep South. In fact, there is an article that was criticizing him. One journalist stated that the state of Mississippi, the poorest in the country, generates about 30,000 of goods and services per person every year. In Zimbabwe, that number is 1,700. But the thing about this figure is that this is per capita production in Mississippi. It doesn't mean that the average income for people in Mississippi is $30,000. Is that misleading of a critique of him and what his kind of message is?
The ending of that very phrase you just quoted was, in Zimbabwe, people die of diarrhea, while in Mississippi, they die from heart attack. I would rather be in the second group, that very same reporter said. As misleading as it can get, she is just trying to throw all those figures to the actual practical claims and experiences that Mr. Theroux told me, and he obviously told the rest of the country in his new book, where you can see the extreme poverty in its worst. You can say things like $30,000 per person. It doesn't mean any person would have $30,000. Right. And that's obviously the case of the southern states, what Mr. Theroux has said. So he made a good point in one of the bits in the interview, which did not actually air yesterday, that those people who write things like that, they don't travel to places like Zimbabwe and the Deep South. They don't get to see what it actually looks like. But it's always easy to cover themselves up behind the barrage of different figures, especially if they don't match the actual reality on the ground.
Yeah, it's always easy to intellectualize something when you don't actually have to see it or live it or talk to people who've lived it. And I think poverty is definitely one of those things on all levels. One of the interesting things is the idea that this didn't really have to happen. Corporations didn't have to send everything to China. We didn't have to outsource that to foreign countries. As you talked about, Nike could have, for instance, had produced its sneakers in Arkansas,
exactly.
or in any of these other states, in any states, even Midwestern states that lost a lot of industry. So the question is, what justification do these corporations give for shipping everything abroad, especially when it's a $400 sneaker, so your profit margin is it worth it that much? So what's the justification?
The justification is plain and simple: larger profits, bigger profits for the corporations. Mr. Theroux actually questioned that in one of the other parts of the interview, which didn't air, that do those corporations really need to have such profits, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 billion dollars a year, when they could have lesser profits, but people would be fed, would have jobs. There would be no extreme poverty cases in the country which boasts to be in top 3. I'm not sure it's the case. I'm not sure if the United States is the top economy still, but at least it's in the top 3.
Well, that would more people will be able to afford the products. If they're paying a lot of employees a good livable wage and are bringing it here, they could buy the $400 shoe from Nike.
Right. It goes back to that Ford idea. It's like,
and again, Arkansas is the place where things like that could have been produced. It used to be one of the leaders in the shoemaking industry in the United States when it was moved from north to south for obviously cheaper labor. it was producing a lot of shoes, and you know, all those LeBron shoes who were purchased at $350 in a Nike store, they could have been made in Arkansas as opposed to China,
or in Cleveland, where LeBron's from. Quickly, Alexei, you apparently also were attacked for this story on Twitter when people responded that they had seen towns and places in Russia that were far worse than the American South. What is your response quickly to that criticism?
It wasn't really an attack. People just threw at me that, you know, Russia is also poor. I said, like, yeah, I've seen extreme poverty in Russia and extreme poverty in the United States with my own eyes. The problem is, not the problem, but the issue here is that Russia does not boast as the country of opportunities, as the country of top 3 economies. It admits we have poverty. Like, that time is now to admit that the United States has poverty here. And one of the notions that Mr. Theroux brought up as well, that the lack of information about what's happening in the southern states of the country, people do not know about it. People do not talk about the poverty that people are going through in the south of this country. It needs to change, according to Mr. Theroux, and I wholeheartedly agree. We need to know more about that in order for something to be done about this.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
And I think we've seen that this year, and if anything really good comes out of what all of the really unsettling, horrible things that have happened, from Katrina to what happened in North Carolina and what we're seeing here in poverty, is that the South deserves our attention,
Yes.
whether, you know, through education, through infrastructure. They need better politicians down there that are serving the needs of the people, and they deserve better. And I think they've kind of gotten the short end of the stick a lot in being like, well, it's the South.
Yeah.
That's just how they are.
Most definitely.
Where I think we all can kind of maybe start pushing a little bit harder to help people down there and make things better.
But Mr. Theroux wants to make the country better by drawing attention to this problem.
Fantastic.
He's not trying to say the South is bad or
Exactly.
the government is bad. It's just that we need to solve this problem,
to
and
solve
the way to do it is to get the businesses back.
Definitely. Well, Alexei Yarshievsky, thank you so much for coming on
always a
today.
pleasure.
Always a pleasure, man.
Thank you.